New York City's Rent Guidelines Board has finally realized that landlords were facing a ton of increased costs due to inflation, and they are recommending that rent controlled units be allowed to raise their rents by 16% next year. And tenants are not happy. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News.
The numbers are just calculations at this point. They come after the board reviewed the price index of operating costs for buildings, a report that shows it cost landlords over 8% to operate their buildings in the past year.
What they said is using various calculations, taking in various economic factors like inflation, like the costs involved in running buildings, like the income that they've lost over the past several years. If we took these factors into consideration, this is what rent increases could look like.
Michael Toman is with the Rent Stabilization Association.
But it is a stark and compelling reminder of the numbers involved in running these buildings. It's also important to note that rent stabilized buildings are owned by private individuals. These are private owners that are providing a public benefit.
It was just last year the board approved the largest increases in almost a decade, a 3.25% on one-year leases and a 5% on two-year leases, also citing rising costs for landlords.
All right, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over the fact that the Rent Guidelines Board in New York City has finally realized that landlords, we're suffering from inflation too, and all of our costs have increased, all of them, okay? Cost of maintenance, the cost of repairs, the cost of everything has gone up. Yet for years now, while the prices were inflating, they've been ignoring it. They've been just pretending like, oh, well, it doesn't matter that your costs are going up. You know, we're not going to allow you to have a nice size rent increase. Well, finally, they can't deny it anymore. And they're looking at the numbers and they're like, hey, yeah, landlords are going to go under if they're not able to raise their rents up to a certain level. And this is a big problem, okay? I've been talking about this for a long time. Even though I'm not from New York, I see the way that these things go, and it's like a slow speed train wreck, right? And you're just like, oh, this is just, as it slowly collapses. That's why I cover these rent control articles. I want to show everyone that these programs do not work. Government price controls do not work, okay? It ends up with a whole bunch of people who can't even do maintenance on their buildings because the government won't allow them to raise prices enough to cover those costs. That's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous. But this is what they want. This is what they think is a good idea. If you're a brand new real estate investor and you're living in New York, do not buy a rent control building, okay? It is a horrible, horrible idea, in my opinion, okay? You might think differently, but I will never change my mind. I don't buy any property that is in a place where there's rent control. I will not. I refuse. So anyway, right now they're talking about this big rent, this possible rent increase, right? Well, think of it like this. They had talked about a large rent increase last year as well. And I did a video on that, and the landlords did not get nearly as big a rent increase as was needed to cover the cost of inflation. So landlords are already very, very far behind on the amount of rents they should be able to charge. But because they have politicians and tenant rights advocates in charge of this rent guidelines board, they will not allow landlords to actually raise rents to cover the costs, okay? Instead, they just will put them out of business. And this is exactly what will happen in all places that have rent control in place, okay? There's no common sense, there's no logic, there's only feelings. Oh, I feel that rent increase is too high. Well, it doesn't matter what you feel if all of the costs have gone up, okay? And telling a landlord that they don't deserve to make a profit, well, that's just telling a landlord that, hey, don't do business in my city. Don't be a landlord here. Don't rent your property out here. Don't build new rentals here because we won't allow you to make any money off of them. They wonder why there's a housing shortage. So before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button, maybe leave a comment down below and let me know what you think. Do you believe that this rent guidelines board is going to take this information on inflation and actually give landlords the size rent increase that is actually needed? Or do you think that they're going to side with the tenants and give them a much, much smaller increase that will not cover their increase in costs? leading, of course, to more landlords going bankrupt. Well, you already know what I believe. And if you're a landlord, I'm sure that you know the truth as well. But, there's a lot of tenants who watch my videos, and, I've been reading the comments a lot more lately. And, the tenants are like, hey, well, you never look at it from the tenant's perspective. Well, the tenant has to face reality. Okay. Here is the reality. If you tenants aren't paying enough rent to cover all of our expenses, what do you think is going to happen? What do you think is going to happen? First, the landlord's going to cut back on maintenance and repairs. Okay, so the apartment you're living in is going to fall into disrepair. The second thing that's going to happen is that the landlord could possibly lose the property. And if the landlord loses the property, you're not a winner. You're a loser at that point. So, yeah, anyway, let me get into this article. This article is coming from the NewYorkPost.com, and it says, the left's war on landlords is destroying New York City's housing. And yes, I believe there is a war on landlords in New York. They truly believe that private property ownership is the root of all evil. That's what these socialists believe. So anyway, let's get into the article and see what it says. A preliminary Rent Guidelines Board report last week raises the possibility of an eye-popping 8.25% hike for roughly 1 million rent-regulated units. The City Council's Progressive Caucus is howling, yet anything less than the suggested 8.25% rise for one-year leases, 15.75% hike for two-year ones, would be another blow to affordable housing, deepening the city's housing crisis. Those figures simply reflect the rising costs faced by property owners, such as a whopping 19% jump in the cost of fuel for heating and an 8.1% spike in building maintenance costs. And that comes on top of expensive renovations required by Local Law 97's climate mandates and a state law forcing older units too costly to renovate off the market. And they bring up a good point, something that I mentioned in a video before. New York City passed these climate mandates that require them to go to net zero or get rid of natural gas. And I mean, the mandates were ridiculous, okay? And to retrofit some of these older buildings is going to cost hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And it's ridiculous. It is absolutely ridiculous when you're saying, hey, go over here, spend hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars retrofitting these buildings for the climate, but we're not going to allow you to have a rent increase to cover the cost. No, you just have to eat that cost. What do you think the landlords are going to do? Okay? It would probably be cheaper to pay the fines than it would be to actually do all of the upgrades that they were requiring, because they can't raise their rents to cover the costs. The Rent Guidelines Board that they created has created the situation where there's no way to recuperate your costs, and they don't give a crap if landlords go bankrupt, if buildings fall into disrepair. They'll go and they'll be like, there was a horrible fire and the ceiling is leaking and all these problems, and we don't understand why the landlords aren't fixing it. Why aren't the landlords fixing all these problems? Well, they don't have any money. They don't have any money because you wouldn't allow them to raise rents. Okay? And don't tell me that landlords are all super rich, because that is just not the case. There are so many landlords out there who are just struggling to get by, especially when they're dealing with these sort of situations. Not to mention all the landlords screwed by tenants who use the long pandemic ban on evictions as a license to not pay rent for over a year. All across the city, small landlords are on the ropes, their life savings tied up in buildings that cost all of the rental income or more to maintain. Hundreds are deeply underwater. If the RGB doesn't allow them to hike rents to cover the increasing costs, they'll have to save somewhere. Many will have no choice but to cross their fingers and defer necessary building maintenance. And some honest landlords, especially the many minority and immigrant ones, will see no choice but to sell to more unscrupulous ones. All of which means the city's existing affordable housing stock will deteriorate. A lot of the smaller landlords are the ones who provide the most affordable housing within the city. And when they decide to sell, they sell to these mega corporations, right? And there's nothing wrong with a mega corporation being a landlord, but the mega corporations are a lot less flexible when it comes to all of the rules, especially because they have to be very, very strict in order to turn a profit. So yeah, you end up with a lot of these super corporations owning the properties. They're a lot less strict when it comes to the rules, and overall, the affordable housing stock will deteriorate and then disappear eventually. If you notice, right, the number of rent-controlled units within the city of New York is declining. It is declining. It's not growing. Nobody's building rent-controlled units. Nobody wants to build rent-controlled units. That would be dumb. Okay, only an idiot would build a unit and it'd be stuck under rent control. No, the number of units is declining, and it will continue to decline. And the only people who are going to benefit from rent control are the people who are already in those units, not the future people who want to move to New York. They're going to be stuck in market rate rentals, paying $5,000 a month or whatever the market rate is. Okay, or they might end up subletting from a rent controlled unit and still paying the market rate. Either way, the new residents to the city, they're not going to benefit at all from rent control. I laugh because to me, this rent control is the ultimate sign of like selfishness, right? Like it only matters that my rent is cheap. That's the way rent control tenants think. Okay, they don't care if their city is deteriorating. They don't care if new housing stock is being built. They don't care if no one else in the entire city is able to find a cheap place to live. Just as long as their place is cheap. Dumb. It's dumb. All of which means, oh, I'm sorry. Lefty tenant activists have been setting New York's political agenda for years now. Under Mayor Bill de Blasio, they got the RGB to set rent hikes at zero for multiple years. And they're now pushing statewide rent control via so-called good cause eviction bill. They've also stymied Kathy Hochul's drive to promote new housing construction in this year's budget. We didn't agree with all of her agenda, but she's getting none of it. And it looks like the legislator will punt on doing anything. Meanwhile, the Real Estate Board of New York reports a sharp drop in newly proposed building projects in this year's first quarter, down 45% from 2022 and 24% below the average since 2008. Yeah, they had a 45% drop in the number of new proposed units. And I'm not surprised, okay, because the number of proposed units before even was far, far less than the number that needs to be built. And basically that was cut in half. All of this is caused by the policies that they promote. All of this is caused by the fact that, hey, there's no incentive whatsoever for developers or landlords to provide housing. There's none. Okay, if you're treated as the enemy, you're going to go where you're not treated as the enemy. And that's what my suggestion would be to any landlords who are looking to invest there. Now, the developers who are working there, they know the system, they know the laws, they know the things they have to do in order to make money. And you can make a lot of money. But it's just not the kind of place where that sort of thing is easy. I feel like they act like we should be, it's a privilege for us to provide housing to them. No, it's not. Okay, it's the other way around. It's a privilege for you to have housing provided by us. And until they learn that, right, things are never going to change.